Hi, this is Dr. Matthew Giobbi. We're going to be taking a look at what is known as human science psychology, or a psychology that is based in the humanities rather than in the current natural science approach to psychology. So this might be a topic in psychology that you are unfamiliar with, but this is going to be an introduction to understanding the aspects of psychology, the schools of thought in psychology that are based in the humanities rather than based in the natural sciences. So this is a distinction that we sometimes fail to recognize simply because of the predominance of a natural science approach. So biological psychology, the use of causal experimental methodology that is predominant throughout psychology. Humanities psychology would include areas of psychoanalysis. It includes areas of humanism, humanistic psychology. It includes areas of existential psychology and phenomenological psychology. And in particular, we are going to be looking at the areas of psychology that include humanism, phenomenology, existentialism, and what is known as transpersonal psychology. So these are aspects of psychology that are based exclusively in the humanities, and we refer to this as human science rather than natural science. So this is an approach that is different than looking at a causal, experimental design, biological, materialistic, reductionistic, mechanistic understanding of the human condition. Now, the accompanying reading to this lecture comes from A Critical History and Philosophy of Psychology by Walsh, Teo, and Baidala. That's Cambridge University Press, and it follows very closely the material presented in Chapter 10. So this lecture will correspond very closely to that text. Here we see a reproduction of Pablo Picasso's Guernica. And if we just take a look at this painting and approach it, we can have an emotional response to it. We can have an intellectual response to it. And of course, that emotional and intellectual response will be largely determined by what we bring to the painting, or what personal attributes and experiences, historical and sociocultural understandings that we bring to understand the symbolism in this painting. I mean, we see here some things that stand out: an electric light bulb, a horse that's twisted. We see suffering individuals here, people who are confused, disembodied, and dismembered figures. We see here the figure of what's symbolic, if we know about the Pieta, about the Virgin Mary and the infant Christ. We see a broken sword. We see suffering and death. If we understand that, of course, this is a painting that Picasso painted depicting the German bombing in support of Franco during the Spanish Revolution. The nationalists were supported by Hitler, and the German planes bombed the city of Guernica, largely killing civilians, and it had very little or no military value whatsoever. It just had many anti-nationalist civilians. And so this painting is often used as a reminder to the civilian suffering of war, how people suffer at the hands of technology. Now, knowing this, we can then begin to look at this painting with a little bit of an historical and social context to this. We can begin to understand this painting in a different way, how maybe the electric light bulb and technology represents things that bring light and also suffering, knowledge and suffering. We now understand that this is about civilian suffering and how technology has brought about suffering on a mass extent that was not known before the technological innovations of bombs and airplanes, etc. Now, of course, this interpretation would be different from an art historian's perspective, an expert in art, or would certainly be different from an individual who might be a historian of the Spanish Civil War. But what we're doing here is we're offering an explanation that goes beyond causation. We're offering an interpretation. We're looking to understand this painting, who painted it, when it was painted, what it was about, why it was painted, what it depicts, what the symbolism is. We're searching for an understanding that goes beyond causal explanation. And in order to arrive at that understanding, we must use interpretation. Now, what this has to do with psychology is that humanistic and humanities-based or human science-based psychologists believe that understanding is more important than explanation, than causal explanation, and that we should be treating human beings and their entire event of context, in other words, their history, their life history, the socio-cultural history that embodies them, the context of which they live, their emotions, their thinking, their interpretations, their worldviews, all must be interpreted by an expert, by someone who understands how to interpret these things to better understand that individual. And this differs quite a bit from a natural science psychology that largely uses experimentation and laboratory work to get not at understanding but at causal explanation. So the main distinction that we want to use in understanding a humanities-based psychology is this distinction between understanding through interpretation versus explanation through laboratory research, through causal, experimental, and quantitative research. So this is illustrated nicely through understanding the interpretation of artwork. Now, this method of interpretation, this discussion of interpreting symbols and interpreting signs, has a name, and the name is hermeneutics. And hermeneutics comes from the word Hermes, and Hermes was the messenger in Greek mythology who explained and conveyed to humans the meaning of the divine messages of the gods. This tradition goes back to ancient Greece, to Aristotle, and when we discuss hermeneutics, we're referring to understanding through interpretation. Now, the use of hermeneutics might be familiar to you if you've studied, had a course in philosophy, or had a course in religious studies or theology, literature. Hermeneutics is one of the main research methods, if not the main research methods, of all of these areas of study. It was greatly influenced by the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, and when we talk about hermeneutics in a religious studies context or theology context, we usually have four different types of interpretations that can take place. So in some individuals' reading of, say, a sacred text, there's a literal interpretation, and that means the understanding comes as the actual message. For example, a literal interpretation of the Hebrew scriptures would be that the earth was, or the universe was, created in 6 days. It's literally 6 days. There's also another type of interpretation called a moral interpretation. And the word moral here doesn't mean right or wrong as in morals. It means the moral, the meaning, like the moral of the story. What is the meaning of the story? So this type of interpretation would be understanding the meaning, the moral meaning of the story. So it would not be a literal interpretation, but it would be a moral message. There's allegorical interpretations, and this is looking for hidden meanings. What the garden represents, or the tree of knowledge represents. This would be an allegorical interpretation. And finally, a mystical interpretation would look for things such as maybe numerology and looking for different hidden mystical, maybe even mathematical components that underline the message, looking for hidden meanings that go beyond the allegorical to some sort of mysticism. So these are 4 different types of interpretation that we can do. We can have a literal interpretation, a moral interpretation, an allegorical interpretation, and a mystical interpretation. So how do we get at this understanding through interpretation? We're going to use as our baseline, as our base understanding of understanding through interpretation, a definition used by the German hermeneutic thinker Friedrich Schleiermacher. And Schleiermacher said that understanding comes through empathizing with the thoughts, intentions, and feelings of others. And this word empathy means placing oneself in the world of the other to experience their world. And this is going to be our baseline of understanding hermeneutics through Schleiermacher's definition. Empathizing with the thoughts, intentions, and feelings of others. So putting ourselves in the worldview of another. Now let's compare and contrast the history and multiple thinkers who use hermeneutic investigation of psychology in comparison with this basic understanding and definition of Schleiermacher, which is interpretation and understanding through empathy with the other. One of the basic distinctions that we make between natural science and human science psychology is the difference between explaining and understanding. Of course, explaining is looking for causal, mechanistic, reductionistic, and often materialistic explanations, cause and effect links that we find in predominant contemporary psychology. Understanding, of course, is what we're after in hermeneutics through interpretation, and as we've seen, through empathy. We can make another distinction between nomothetic and ideographic research. So nomothetic would be explaining. It would be looking for general laws. And this is very common in causal natural science psychology, looking for overreaching deterministic laws which can be applied either in biological determinism or environmental determinism, which some people call nature and nurture. Or a combination of the two, etc. And ideographic research is really more applicable to hermeneutics. Ideographic research is interpretation of and description of individual events. So this is more of a descriptive rather than an explanatory. Again, description leads to interpretation and understanding, which is distinctly different from explanation. We turn firstly to the work of HANS-GEORG Gadamer. And Gadamer followed the lead of Martin Heidegger, who felt that interpretation was the core of being. So the nature of being, that is the essence of being, what we would say the human experience, is interpretation. And this goes back to Aristotle, that the key feature of being human is the ability to understand through interpretation. In his most famous work, Truth and Method, this is a sizable, thick book, which is well worth reading if you're interested, as a starting point, if you're interested in psychology based in the humanities. This is really the book, Truth and Method, to start with. And in this book, Gadamer describes most of his core proposals about a humanities-based psychology. I guess the central feature, the central thing for Gadamer is that the interpretation is not something that is just objective. Every individual's interpretation is based on their pre-established understandings of the world, their worldview. Pre-understanding influences what one sees and how they interpret it, and even their ability to empathize, etc. And this is where he was very critical of the natural science approach, because he argued that scientists mistakenly understood their work as being completely objective, but they were unaware and didn't take into considerations their assumptions that preceded their idea of objectivity. So the methodology itself was set on of natural science is based on a certain preconception, a prejudicial understanding of what is being observed and measured, and what is included in the discussion, etc. So one of the core issues here is understanding that interpretation is based on personal pre-understandings or pre-understanding approach. Now, another important critique that Gadamer makes of natural science approach is the belief in natural science that if you use the method, you get to scientific fact. Now, for Gadamer, this is flawed thinking. He says that ontology precedes epistemology. Ontology precedes epistemology. So in other words, method is what constructs knowledge. It's not that you arrive at knowledge or fact through method. That method reveals it. Method actually constructs the knowledge. So in this way, he says ontology precedes epistemology. Gadamer says that hermeneutics must be used to enhance, augment, to improve the natural science approach. He says that in contemporary society, there's an idolatry of the scientific method. In other words, it's even in psychology, we can often find that it's somehow unpatriotic or a betrayal of the field to even question if psychology is a science. Of course, this comes from psychologists mostly. Outside of psychology, it's not widely accepted that psychology is a natural science. Some exceptions to this recently would be biological psychology, which deals with communication systems in the body and is largely materialistic and reductionistic and mechanistic. But Gadamer says that it's our responsibility to have a hermeneutic challenge in psychology to the idolatry of the scientific method, this hegemonic role of the scientific method and the natural science approach in our field. Truth and Method, Gadamer writes, "The individual case does not serve only to confirm a law from which practical predictions can be made. Its ideal is rather to understand the phenomenon itself in its unique and historical concreteness. The aim is not to confirm and extend these universalized experiences in order to attain knowledge of a law, but to understand how this man, this people, or this state is what it has become, or more generally, how it has happened that it is so." And what Gadamer is saying here is that the human sciences make an error in trying to emulate the natural sciences. He says that natural science is not designed to provide an understanding of the human experience, just like the human sciences are not useful in discovering natural laws. They are two incompatible projects that are occurring here. As a side note, we find that in psychoanalysis, when Sigmund Freud developed what he called the new science, he was going, before Gadamer, of course, but he was going after exactly what Gadamer describes here. The new science of psychoanalysis was developing methodology that could study the aspects of the human condition that Gadamer is referring to here. In Freud's case, it was the non-observable and non-measurable aspects of the unconscious. What then should we study as psychologists? Well, according to Gadamer, the study of psychology should be about what humans produce. And what humans, the quintessential thing that humans do produce is art and technology. So Gadamer says we should turn to looking to art to understand what this this human condition is, the psychology, and he discusses this as something called phronesis. So this is understanding. It's the moral of the meaning of the story. So looking at art and understanding how it's made and who made it, why it's made, kind of like we did with the Guernica painting. This would be a phronetic or phronesis. Episteme rather is explaining or causal knowledge. This is a contrasted way of understanding in the natural sciences. So we're looking at phronesis, which is an understanding of the moral. He also criticizes episteme in the natural sciences as being flawed because of the interdependency of subject and object. We have an individual who becomes the object of their own subjectivity. We then have a built-in difficulty in understanding a distinction between the I and my object and the object of research. So in essence, the research topic becomes the object, and the subject is understanding the object, which means that there's this subject-object dualism that creates a problem in the human sciences. We tend to understand objects as things that exist outside of the human explanation or human subjectivity, and Gadamer says this is just a flawed way of thinking. To illustrate the issues that occur when applying natural science to human beings, in other words, basing psychology into natural sciences, Gadamer discussed 6 concepts. And these 6 concepts, he said, should be considered by all psychologists in how they understand what it is they're studying. So these are the 6 concepts of hermeneutics for psychologists. The first is that understanding is framed by a point of view. So we always understand the limitations of the idea of objectivity. There's always a preconceived point of view that is going to shape the understanding. Personal experience limits our understandings. The third thing, one can transcend their own personal horizon. So one's personal horizon is their worldview, and one can transcend this. And the way you transcend it is by investigating outside of your worldview, expanding your worldview, studying from multiple perspectives. The fourth issue Gadamer talks about is tradition is prejudicial thinking. The moment that we align ourselves with a traditional way of thinking, a tradition in thinking, whether that be the tradition of the rules of natural science or a certain philosophical or psychological school of thought, we have already placed limitations on our understanding. If we only view things as a psychoanalyst or as a psychodynamic thinker, as a behaviorist or as a cognitive psychologist, we are prejudging our topic before we even consider it. Understanding others is questioning one's own point of view. In other words, if you want to really understand others, you have to call into question your assumptions, especially your traditional prejudices. And one of the core aspects here, and this comes from Heidegger, is language precedes thought. Now, in most of natural science, typical of psychology and thinking in general, we would understand language as describing thought. For Gadamer and for Heidegger, thought is grammatical. So we think through our language. Heidegger famously said, we go about thinking that we do language when in fact language does us. So we learn to think through the confines and the shackles of our grammatical usage, past, present, and future, subject, object. All of these things that we call reality are built into our grammar. And for Gadamer, we don't view the world and describe it through our grammar. We view the world through our grammar. Our grammar, the language that we speak, what we've learned, shapes how we view the world. This can be even illustrated through linguistic relativism and understanding that the structure of the grammar that one is raised in influences how they see the world and how they come to think about what reality is, what facts are.